Are commercial banks vital to our economy, or are they relics of a broken system? We're pulling back the curtain on the big middlemen, and we're doing it live. See you in a moment. Are commercial banks middlemen, gatekeepers, or just an out-of-date institution? We're going to be exploring whether commercial banks are vital economic bridges, or if they're toll booths extracting value and controlling the flow of capital. Do they just move money around, or are they creating it? Yes. And if so, is that a feature or a flaw? That's where it gets complicated. But first, have you shared us with your heterodox mates? Liking and subscribing is totally free. It helps us, and who knows, it might even help you. Do commercial bank practices stabilize the economy, or are they part of the problem of the boom and bust cycles we all experience? And finally, we'll ask if it's time for new ideas that could reshape how money works. Mike is away. He's at the ham radio equivalent of the Olympics. But joining me is Steve, of course, the star of the show. So let's get started. Steve Keen, come on down. There he is. How'd you be, Steve?
Not too bad. I'm currently shooting by. I've been editing a file on my. I was going to show a Ravel file in the middle of this discussion, of course, and I saw it spelled interest, INTREREST. So I just tried doing a global search and replace, and I hope I haven't trashed my model in the process. But I'm back.
Well, first world nerd problems. This is good. All right. But you know,
nerd problems.
How are we managing to catch you out every time? It's great. It's like this kind of like, oh, there's Steve working at his desk. I just noticed there's this live stream on. So
I've got INTRERST. So I apologize for that when it turns up on screen. Yeah.
Quite all right.
Always, my life is being distracted.
That's
I'm trying to fly. If you know the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I'm trying to learn how to fly.
Welcome to my world. Like, I think this is the modern disease, isn't it? Endless distraction, and fighting it is the only way you get anything done. I'll just why don't I just outline roughly what we're going to do, and just so audience knows, there's the sort of 4 areas that we're going to dive into, and then we'll tackle them one by one. So we've got first section is going to be, are commercial banks necessary, and what functions they serve? Then we're going to get on to if commercial banks are useful, how they operate, intermediation or money creation. If you know anything about Steve Keen, you'll know the answer to that already. What is the macroeconomic impact of bank lending, and how should it be regulated? And then finally, we're going to look at alternatives, if there are any, to the current banking system, and how it might be better. So those are the areas, Steve. Any thoughts at first for somebody who's I suppose coming at this from either banks, we don't need them at all, sort of one end of the spectrum, to banks are exactly perfect the way they are. What would you say to just frame this so that we can, get people can get a handle on the heterodox sort of view of banks?
Well, I mean, the banks are one of the most confusing elements of our financial system, really bizarrely enough, because it should be straightforward what they do. But we've been dominated by an economic theory, neoclassical economics, that fundamentally argues banks are what they call intermediaries. And what that means in a practical sense, when it comes to how mainstream economists build their models of the economy, they have models of banking that excuse them not having models of banking inside their macroeconomic models. So it's quite strange. And if you go back and see why did this happen? If you go back to the sort of, in some ways, the foundations of neoclassical economics, it was with people who believed that utility was the source of value. And this is still the common attitude of neoclassicals and Austrians today. And one of the first was Jean-Baptiste Say. If you've heard of Say's law, then Jean-Baptiste is who you've heard about. And he argued in what he called a Catechism of Political Economy, written back in the early 1820s, that just to take just a punchline out of it, merchants though they do, all of them have the air of demanding money for their merchandise, do in fact demand merchandise for their merchandise. In other words, money is just a intermediary, a token itself. Nobody wants to accumulate money. Nobody wants to hide the amount of money they've got. Both which, of course, are totally off with the fairies pieces of nonsense. Well, that's what he wrote in the proposition, and that became ingrained into neoclassical economics, so that money is just as Ghost on the Half Shell is saying here, a veil over barter. You remove the veil to see what's going on. Okay, that's the idea. So that's the perspective we've got on banking. It's completely wrong. It's abjectly contradicted by the data when you take a close look at the relationship between bank money creation and economic activity. According to the mainstream view, there should be no relationship. According to the data, the correlation is virtually one-on-one. It's just crazy. So we really need a realistic picture of what banks do, and the opposition to that is coming from economics textbooks and economics professors.
And so, just to be clear, then, to answer the question, are commercial banks necessary, and what we'll cover what functions they serve, but to some degree, they're always going to be necessary. We don't barter was a myth to the degree that it's used as a way of some prehistoric form of money. So, if that's the case, where do commercial banks then fit in, and are they still necessary? Should we answer that one just even more clearly, Steve? Is that all right?
Well, I mean, money is vital, and capitalism, as Keynes put it, and also Graziani, capitalism is a monetary system of production. Money plays the major organisational role. There's not a plan. There's flows of money that determine who gets what, who gets resources to invest and who doesn't, and so on. So money is the ultimate constraint, the ultimate cause of ups and downs in the economy. And what you're seeing there on chain right now, thank you for Ty, on that front, is the annual change in the level of private debt, which is called credit, divided by GDP. So you're giving it a ratio. So it's the ratio of newly created credit money to the level of economic activity. And if you look at that chart, where one goes up, when credit goes up, unemployment goes down, and vice versa. They're virtually what used to be called a Rorschach plot. If you know the old psychology test they used to do, you put ink on a blotter, fold it together, take a look at it and see what you think you're seeing. Most people see sex. Economists don't see money at all. But money, when you look at it, is absolutely vital to causing the booms and busts of a capitalist economy. So it's vital in terms of what it does in a symptomatic sense. And capitalism is all about making money. I mean, one of my favorite ripostes to my favorite riposte to say about merchants do in fact demand merchandise for their merchandise was Marx in the Volume 1 of Capital saying, accumulate, that is Moses and the prophets. In other words, what you're trying to do is accumulate money. That's first and foremost what capitalists are after. Money is absolutely critical to understanding what's going on there. They're not after, and he also said it's a capital mistake, pardon the pun, to see the role of capitalists as being the consumption of commodities. What they're trying to do is accumulate money. And so that's the perspective we should have. It's not a damning capitalism. It's describing it. That's what capitalists are about. And banks play a fundamental role in that whole process. So if you leave banks out of your model, which mainstream economists do, you're not modeling capitalism.
What do neoclassical economists see in the Rorschach test, Steve?
Oh, they fail abjectly. They don't even see sex.
Yeah, probably see sex as well.
It's I'm not, economics 101 lesson saying, I'm not convinced capitalists are trying to accumulate money so much as other forms of wealth. Well, they're going to die with lots of yachts and private jets and stuff like that, okay? But if you look at the amount of money, like, for example, Elon Musk, $400 billion. He's not trying to accumulate, he's trying to sell electric cars, not accumulate them, trying to shoot rockets into the sky, not get a huge collection of them. It'd be simply impossible for any of the the billionaires we all know and loathe. Sorry, I meant to say love. If we try to imagine them consuming what they've got left in the time they've got left, most of them would simply explode if they tried to consume anything like the amount of time they've got left. It's not the net current amount yet. That's correct, okay. But if they wanted to liquidate what he's got and spend it, he could never do it. You sell all the Tesla shares, or put SpaceX onto the stock market and get the capital out of it. There's no way he's going to spend all that stuff, even if you're getting stuff to Mars. Accumulating firms, he's after power economics 101. And the main form of power in capitalism is money. You're clouding things up by obscuring it. He wants something different called power, yeah? How do you get power in capitalism? You accumulate lots of money.
Which can then be used to buy resources, which gets you more power.
Yeah.
So if, on the broad assumption then that commercial banks are useful, let's then look at how they operate, Steve. And for those who aren't familiar with you, intermediation or money creation, or loanable funds versus endogenous money, let's cover that, because I think, assuming that now we know that to some degree, if you're going to have a capitalist system and describe it properly, you've got to have commercial banks. This problem that comes up all the time in economics about if money's created or not, let's tackle that again. And sorry for those of you chatters who have heard us talk about this before, but I think it's impossible to ignore the elephant in the room when we're talking about commercial banks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so if you read mainstream economics, what you get told is banks are intermediaries. Banks don't actually create money, and they don't lend money. What they do is they operate as a introduction service between people who save money and people who want to borrow money. And for those who are old enough to know, I call it the Ashley Madison theory of banking, which is, Ashley Madison, if you don't know it, if you're too young to know about Ashley Madison, that was a website that introduced married couples to have sex with each other when they weren't in fact married to each other. And so you paid a fee to Ashley Madison. They'd introduce you. You get sex from the other person. So Madison didn't give you sex, but they gave you a way to have sex with somebody else, and they charged a fee for the introduction. And that's fundamentally how the mainstream models what banks actually do. Now, can I push the friendship here and show a Ravel model, or am I pushing my luck here? Dave,
go on, Steve. Of course. No, let's get something out.
Okay, so let's just do that over here. Hang on a second to make the right scale. And then I've got to just change my scale over here so I can actually see the button for sharing the screen. That seems to be H. Okay, share this entire screen. Okay, and I'm just going to go across to the view of just what banks are supposed to be according to mainstream economics when you show it through a godly table, which is one of the critical elements of Ravel, the financial transactions. So what you've got, the idea is that savers and borrowers and the banks all put money inside a bank, and so that money goes into reserves for the bank itself. That's this safe, effectively. And then savers lend money to borrowers, so there's a transfer of money which in borrowed dollars per year going from savers across to borrowers. Borrowers then pay interest on that back to the bank, to the savers. That's all, just the banking system being used as a conduit, effectively. And then the only way you can explain how banks make money out of this is to argue they charge a fee, either to the borrower or the saver. In this model, I'm saying the saver pays a fee to the bank. And then what tends to be left out of the way people think about banking and money flows in general is they think about paying interest. They don't realize the bank also spends back into the same system. So there's circulation going on here. So the banks then spend, and they make a simple model here. I'm just saying they spend on borrowers. They don't spend on savers. That's just make the model less complicated than what otherwise need to be, still getting the same results. And then savers spend on borrowers, and borrowers spend on savers. And that's the basic pattern that you'd get with the mainstream. Now, if you then decide to simulate this and see what actually happens, and I'll just make one of the charts a lot larger here. Hang on a second. If I put that on a decent chart, yeah, okay. So here I've got banks lending and starting off with no lending at all. So you just got existing money turning over, and that existing money then generates GDP. It's a very simple model. So you start off with no debt in the system at all, and GDP stabilizes because there's no money being created. The monetary value of GDP remains constant. Then if you have banks lending, a large amount of money, you can see GDP rises for a short while, but not by much, and then falls back. And the debt ratio is now rising. It's now hit 100% of GDP. Keep on going up. If I now have the banks, people rather than borrowing money, decide to repay their debt money, so you go from positive credit to negative credit, you get a bit of a fall in GDP coming out of that. Again, not a lot of a fall. And then finally, when I bring the level of debt down to, make it say 50% of GDP, and I'll flatline borrowing at that stage, you have some sort of impact upon economic activity. But notice the debt to GDP ratio and GDP are going in opposite directions on that particular chart. Now, that's the way the mainstream thinks about banking. That's what they teach their students, and it justifies the sort of an Occam's razor basis. It says, there'll be a bit of impact of distributing money from savers to borrowers, or borrowers to savers if they have different propensities to consume. But overall, it doesn't matter. You get a simpler model with the same overall outcome if you ignore lending. That's what the mainstream argues. Now, I could do this live, or I can do it by just showing the results. But it takes me about 30 seconds to go from the model that the mainstream has, where savers lend to borrowers, to the real world where banks lend to borrowers, and see what happens. So can I do that? Should I do that live again?
Yeah, go for it. But if you're able to multitask on this one, just have a think about this while you're doing it. There's a question there from Kevin. I was trying to get your angle on. Are there any models of banking where loans and payments are separated?
This is something we can come up to when we talk later in the session, because one of the dangers of if you think about the function of money, one of them is to provide finance for corporations and money for entrepreneurs. So the credit system expands the capacity for economic activity. It's also the payment system. You want to go and buy, a Mars bar, or whatever your particular junk food you're into. You then hand over the money to the shopkeeper, they give you the product back. So the payment system is absolutely critical. Now, the payment system doesn't often freeze completely. The credit system does. If you have a credit boom and bust going on, then when the bust occurs, that's the economic activity can send banks bankrupt. If you have a large plunge in the number of performing loans, and a highly geared banking system, it's quite possible banks will fail. And in that situation, the payment system breaks down, and we have the Federal Reserve and other central banks play a major role in papering over that issue and handling breakdowns in the system. But what causes the payment system to crumble is the credit system. Now, it would be feasible, and this is something we can talk about in desired alternative models later in the hour. You could possibly separate the credit function from the payment system, but looking at that, the cost of the payment system is something of the order of 2% or 3% of the stock of money in existence. It costs money to have bank branches. It costs money to have ATMs. It costs money to have all the electronic payment systems we use these days, to maintain them, ensure security, keep fraud away, etc., etc. So, but it would be possible to make that something that was done by the public sector. We could all have accounts at the central bank. All the payments could go through the central bank, and there's no possibility of the central bank going bankrupt. The payment system would be sustained, and then you could have a much, much smaller financial sector, not responsible for payments anymore, but responsible for loans to entrepreneurs, loans to working capital for corporations, for a defined set of tasks where credit makes sense and where individual decisions by bankers to allocate the money would be more imaginative, but hopefully not speculative, than what were done by a central bank. So it's possible to consider having two separate systems. And I think, in fact, that may be what we're forced to, because the private system is less to function without the level of understanding that regulators need to have. Regulators fall for the same myth that banks are just intermediaries. So they don't pay enough attention to the level of private debt. They don't pay attention to what banks lend to. And what we've ended up with the banking sector is with the banking sector that lends to finance asset bubbles. And that's what leads to the booms and busts of capitalism. So if you actually wanted to get away from that, you could say we still want the creative side, where banks decide who gets new money for a new investment for functional working capital, and then have the government system providing the turnover of money for the basic payment system.
I think
And
this is a chance
this is,
to go and grab that result that you wanted on the graph.
yeah, okay.
If you want to do that, Steve, and then explain that.
Quickly, then we'll come back to the graph that Ty's putting up there as well, which is great, because that actually shows where the inflation came from in the last in the 70s. So this is back to the model again, and once it comes up on screen, and I'll just make it full screen on my other device over here. If you can put it up, okay. Get rid of the chat for a moment so we can see it. So that this is the way that once you say that the banks are intermediaries, then you have money being lent from savers to borrowers, but the debt doesn't turn up on the table because, first of all, you've got double entry. You can't show the borrowing act and increase in debt on the one table. You need to have 3 or 4 entries per row, and that's just that breaks the laws of accounting. What you've got to do is show the debt as an asset of the saver. So that's what's actually in the model. Remember a moment ago I showed when you varied the amount of lending, GDP and debt to GDP went in opposite directions. And what I can do very rapidly with Ravel is bring up this table and say, look, it's a myth that that lending is done by savers, it's done by banks. So I've brought up the godly table for the system here. I'm just going to simply delete debt as an asset of savers and delete the idea that borrowers borrow from savers, delete the bank fee because banks do have fees, but they're not a major form of revenue, and delete the paying of interest. And I come across now, you notice over here that the elements, those are now undertined in the banks table. So I can open the banks table and say, let's just show the real world that loans are an asset of the banking sector. So having deleted loans as an asset of the savers, it's still in there as a liability of the borrowers. I create an extra column and then say that is the debt, which is an asset of the banking sector. And then I can get rid of this fee thing, which is just silly, and then tell the program to balance the equity. So interest is now paid to the banks. Let's run the model again. And I'm going to go back to that tab where I've got the lending fraction, run that. Notice GDP stabilizes here, but if I now increase lending, GDP goes up and it doesn't stop going up. There's not the amount of money is being increased in the system. It's turning over more rapidly. As the level of debt goes up, or the ratio of debt to GDP, so does the level of economic activity. Now, if I bring it down in the other direction, they both go down as well. And that's what we see in the data. What Ty was showing earlier was showing unemployment. So unemployment's the opposite of economic activity. But that's the fundamental role of banks in macroeconomics. They drive the financial system by driving the creation of money. And if you leave it out of a system, you're modeling something nice and curious, but it ain't capitalism.
There's a question there and it probably explains why we can't have nice things like the last part of that graph was Economics in One Lesson saying 2 problems. Lending becomes politicized and central bankers probably know nothing about who they're lending to. Of course, I don't want to get too much into the politics because we're trying to describe the system.
In fact, is why I don't want them to lend. Okay, this is the point. If you separate the payment system from the money creation system, then you can have the central banks managing the payment system, and then you could have the private banks operating as venture capitalists fundamentally and providing venture capital for corporations that they think are going to be successful. That's the sort of division we need, I think, because
as even right down to house loan mortgages, small loans for businesses, everything.
Yeah. It's a challenge on that front because there are some things you don't want banks to lend for. I mean, again, Time will have a chart on this front, but if you look at what banks have been lending for, they've been lending for mortgages fundamentally in the last 20 years. And what they've done is, by actually 25 years, by lending for mortgages, they've driven up house prices. And we've actually made houses into a speculative item, which they shouldn't be. They should be a consumption item, a long-term consumption item. So if you let banks do what they damn well like, they damn well like bubbles. And you end up with a bubble-driven capitalist system, which is dysfunctional. Booms and busts occur all the way through. So I would want to drastically constrain what banks can do on that front. Constrain them for lending, which is socially useful. That's lending for, I don't mean lending for gay whales. I mean lending for things which actually boost the productivity of the capitalist system. That's what's productive.
Lending for gay whales, I kind of know what you mean, but I also have forgotten the reference. I think other people might have, or is that just me? Go on, explain that one, because I've forgotten now.
The gay whales, that's being woke. Okay.
Oh, I see.
That's
right,
being
lending for gay whales.
woke and wet at the same time. Woke and wet and wanking. Okay, that's.
You got them all in together. Great alliteration.
There you have, yeah.
Okay. Such a class act. Great. I tell you what I wanted to ask. It was a follow up to where we're up to with banking. Was if this is assuming right that it's endogenous and that money does get created by banks. What does it matter to us day to day, practically speaking, and how does it impact us that this is seen as a loanable funds theory in the mainstream and the way that it's implemented? Why does it matter to change the thinking about it, and what would it impact?
Well, it's got an enormous difference because loanable funds, you can ignore the banking sector. Okay, you just leave it out of your modeling. You don't see any role for private money creation. The real world, money creation affects real variables. It doesn't just affect the price level, which somebody was asking earlier. It affects aggregate demand as well, and that gets turned into either demand for goods and services or demand for non-financial assets. We borrow money from banks, which is that means the financial liability for us, a financial asset for the banks. We borrow. That's thank you, Tony. Okay, that's the one. Land rights for gay whales. It's one of the original
that was
slogans.
it. Now I remember. Okay, fine.
Okay, thanks, Tony. We appreciate that one. So that the role of banks in loanable funds is just intermediaries. You can leave them out of the system. When you sort of say the banks create money, it ends up that the credit doesn't just cause a change in the price level; it changes the level of real activity as well. The fundamental element of this is that when you borrow money in a loanable funds world, you're borrowing off somebody else. They've got less money to spend, you've got more. If you repay them, they've got more, you've got less. One cancels the other out. I have personally experienced this. It wasn't pleasant. Okay, so long story there. But when banks lend, they create additional money. There's nothing else sacrificed for the additional demand they're creating. And if you use a device that I've invented, I call a Moore table in honor of Basil Moore, who was the original person in the modern era to push the fact that banks create money when they lend. What you can show is that under loanable funds, credit cancels out. So aggregate demand is just the turnover of existing money plus interest payments in loanable funds. When you include that banks create money when they lend, then what you find is credit is part of aggregate demand and income, and that affects both turnover of goods and services and also asset prices. So it's absolutely critical. And if you take a look at the relationship between changes in the level of credit creation and unemployment, again, that chart that Ty showed earlier, the correlation just blows out of the water the argument that there's no role for credit and aggregate demand. The ups and downs are in opposite directions. Credit goes up, unemployment goes down. Credit goes down, unemployment goes up. The correlation over the period between 1990 and 2015 in America is minus 0.93. Now, what neoclassicals tell you, and you can quote Bernanke on this from his book Essays on the Great Depression, he said that what he called pure redistributions, which is what he thinks lending is, should have no significant macroeconomic impact. Now, he never even tested that proposition. He simply said it and rejected the arguments of Irving Fisher and Hyman Minsky that debt matters. And this is the sort of dismissive shit that mainstream economists do all the time. I just want to make this point because it's I've only realized in recent times how they do it. They don't pay attention to critics. They simply dismiss critics. simply to get them out of the way. If they're talking within their own envelope, then they talk avidly and, what's your Euler equation and what function have you got? Are you using Calvo pricing and blah, blah, blah? And there's all these vigorous debates within the envelope. If you talk from outside the envelope, who's that fucker outside the envelope? Don't want to know what they're talking about. So Ben Bernanke, in talking about Hyman Minsky and Kindleberger, this is in these book Essays on the Great Depression. And of course, Kindleberger and Minsky both had explanations of what caused the Great Depression. So what does Ben Bernanke say about them? He says, Charles Kindleberger and Hyman Minsky have argued the instability of the financial system, but in order to make that proposition, have had to abandon the assumption of rationality. Then there's a footnote saying, I don't deny the possible importance of irrationality in economic life, but it seems to me the best research project is to push the rationality postulate as far as it will go. End of discussion.
There's a glimpse of sanity there by the sound of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, they don't want to know. Okay, they're not listening. So fuck them. I'm not talking to them anymore. I'm talking to the real world, to the public.
So, Steve, let's try and tackle then. What is macroeconomic impact? What is the macroeconomic impact of bank lending, and how or whether it should be regulated? So, what are we talking about here? We've got to look at how money creation affects aggregate demand and income. I don't know an easy way into this from what we were talking about before, but basically, should it be regulated more than it is, and if so, how? I don't know if this will again branch into whether interest rates should be a certain rate, or whether interest rates are important when it comes to regulation, or whether or not it's about how we loan. Who gets to choose who gets money and so on. So what's the way into this? How should we talk about whether or not it should be regulated?
Well, I mean, the starting point is that if banks have the power to create money, and they do, that is an enormous power in a capitalist economy, and you want it to be directed to the best uses possible. But one of the feedbacks that happens in banking, and you can find Richard Vague's work on this, which is excellent for several reasons. One, it's based on extremely good historical research. Two, Richard was a quite successful banker in his previous career, so he's actually talking from personal experience. And what he says is, if you simply have unregulated banking, what will happen is that banks will jump into a bandwagon promoting whatever is the current popular fad. So he was a banker in the 1980s in Texas, and the 70s and 80s. And in the late 70s, the oil price rose from $10 a barrel to $40 a barrel. It originally from 2.5 to 10 across the Yom Kippur War period back in 72, 70, 74. And then it went from $10 a barrel to 40 in 79, 80. And then it dropped again to went from 10 to 40 and back to 10 again. So when it was going up towards 40, if you were at a social meeting of bankers and you said you didn't have any loans to oil rigs in Texas, you were kicked out of the party. You were just not with the game. So they all heard it and dived into it. And that's how Richard became successful, because he was managing the consumer wing of one of these banks. They all lent like crazy when it was $40 a barrel. The price plunges to 10. All their loans fail. Their commercial lending collapses. And so the bank started to sell off their retail, the household sector fundamentally, and Richard managed to buy out his household sector and create one of the first of two successful banks. So what you get if you don't have regulations on them, if you don't have something directing towards productive, I wouldn't say choose which productive enterprise, but you choose them to don't let them lend just for bricks and mortar, because they'll cause a bubble in house prices. The bubble in house prices will bust at some stage. We've been through this already. You don't want to do it again, but they're still allowed to lend like crazy for mortgages. So restrict them to productive investment. And you're also, even then, you're going to have booms and busts as we had with the oil bubble back in 1980.
And do you need any new institutions for that if you're going to have a more robust lending criteria, or is it already in place and we're just not using it as it should be?
It's always going to be difficult, because this chart that tries showing now the ups and downs of the oil price, and that actually causing underlying inflation as well. you are going to have the financial system adding to the cyclical instability of a capitalist economy anyway. So you're going to look at when I built my first models of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, I only had productive investment. I assumed that firms were borrowing money for productive reasons. So any money they borrowed turned into factories. The factories produced more goods. The goods would produce more. I
Profit,
was
you'd
being
hope,
distracted
for
by a
them.
ghost who's saying it's astonishing a week. It was 0.63 from memory. The volume, the scales are different. They should be on two y-axes to show that scale. But back to the. I've lost my bloody train of thought. Hang on.
Well, Glass-Steigel there, as mentioned by economics in one lesson, was repealed, and that seemed to have a huge impact. For those that don't know any economic history, if you could just touch on that, Steve, about Glass-Steigel and what it meant.
Well, I mean, Glass-Steagall came about in the aftermath of the Great Depression, because in the Great Depression, retail banks could buy shares. Okay? Now, what that meant was during the 1920s, banks were buying corporate shares, and corporate shares increased radically in value during the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, as we call it. And that meant that the bank's assets rose, and they were all extremely wealthy. It was part of the levered bubble of the 1920s. Then when the share market price collapsed 10% in one day in October 1929, that pretty much wiped out the capital of the banks. So the banks went from being solvent to bankrupt in one day. Now, that's what made one of the things that made the Great Depression great, was that collapse. So a large part of Glass-Steagall was to say you can't buy shares if you are a retail bank. You have to have a non-bank. That's where the non-bank financial institution, what we call shadow banking, evolved from, because they were the ones who bought the shares, but they were no longer the ones creating money. Now, I think there's a bit of, most of the shadow banks are owned by real banks, and I think there's a lot of subterfuge going on in how they actually manage themselves. But fundamentally, you're not going to have banks being wiped out by a share market crash. If we go back to 1987, which is a date that almost everybody's forgotten except me, that's what's in the stock market bubble of the 80s bubble. The stock market in October of 87 fell 20% in one day. Now, if we'd had the same situation as pre-Glass-Steagall, that 20% fall would have wiped out the capital of the banking sector, and we would have had a Great Depression-style crisis at that stage. Instead, to some extent, unfortunately, we sailed through the whole damn thing because Greenspan dived in and rescued the banks and rescued the non-banks as well. And that's basically put us into a totally financialized economy ever since.
Yeah, I don't think I have no idea if there's an easy way to see the effect in terms of a graph or anything between what happened after the end of Glass-Steagall and today. So I won't pretend to know that you can just bring that up, but that would be interesting to know where that impact is shown, and apart from in just I guess let's move on to let's not move on to the next section, if you don't mind, Steve. I was looking at alternatives because that got me thinking. If Glass-Steagall was a problem that was repealed and we never solved what it's done to the institution of banking, I guess, where are we at now with whether or not there are alternatives that are viable? Where are we at in terms of whether or not we're stuck with what we've got, and where do we go from here if commercial banking is a problem that we wanted to solve? So
let's actually just quickly bring up Web Freak's comment there. It's a good one about the downfall of Silicon Valley Bank, because this is another thing which relates to the stupidity of mainstream economists trying to manage the economy using interest rates, because their perspective is that putting up the interest rate reduces what they call inflationary expectations. And in other words, if the interest rate gets higher, we expect the inflation rate to be lower in the future, and therefore, hey presto, the inflation rate falls. Just change the expectations, the price will fall. That's the stupid logic they've got inside their DSGE models. Now, what they're doing, therefore, according to their models, is they put up the interest rate, they reduce inflation. That hasn't happened at all. Like, inflation rose and fell because of supply side shocks, and Ty's work on that is superb to show that the interest rate had bugger all effect. In fact, the country which is most successful in reducing inflation and had the lowest level of inflation during the COVID bubble was Japan, which had a minus 0.25 rate of interest for most of the period, and radically increased the rate from minus 0.25 to zero towards the end of the COVID inflation period. And they did better at fighting inflation and getting lower inflation than anybody else. So the interest rate in that sense is irrelevant. So, but what happens, and this is what happened with Silicon Valley Bank, if you put up the interest rate, you don't change the amount of money the government's paying on bonds at all. You change the rate it has to pay on new bonds that it issues, but you don't change what it's paying on existing bonds. So if you have bonds which are, say, 30-year bonds, and they've got a value of $1,000 face value, and you bought them when the rate was 2%, then if you have a large number of those, and if the interest rate then goes from 2% to 5%, effectively the value of those bonds will fall from $1,000 each to $600 each, and that'll drive you bankrupt. And that's what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. So the reason it didn't happen to the rest of the banking system is somewhat complex, but the basic story is most banks have got a wide portfolio of bonds that they buy, different time periods to expiry and so on. Silicon Valley Bank mainly had 30-year bonds. So the longer the term of the bond, the more it's affected, its price is affected by a rise in the interest rate. So they were hit really, really hard by that. And they actually weren't doing much lending. So they didn't have any other assets to save them. So they were wiped out. The other banks survived because, as part of a fiction to evade being sent bankrupt by fall in the value of bonds, banks are allowed to have what they call mark-to-market and hold-to-maturity classifications for the bonds they have. If they have mark-to-market, they've got to write the value down. If they have hold-to-maturity, they can ignore the fluctuations caused by interest rates and just pretend they're worth their face value. Now, most banks have sufficient stuff in the short-term bonds and so on to play the hold-to-maturity argument. But Silicon Valley, when people started withdrawing money from it, had to liquidate some of the bonds that it had in that hold-to-maturity, and bang, all of a sudden they were wiped out completely.
So sticking with Silicon Valley then, as a good example of a modern run on a bank, right? What are in your alternative trick of bag of tricks? What is it that could be? I've heard talk of infinite guarantees and all sorts of things, but without changing the system entirely, what are some ways that that could be seen as big? Because people were perceiving that their money wasn't safe, which is one of the things that went wrong there. Without talking about how that was happening, and it wasn't happening in other parts of the economy, what could be done maybe to make that system feel safe for people to just leave their money there, basically?
Well, one would be to have floating rates on bonds, because the reason the value of the bonds plunged was because the interest rate rising reduced the value of bonds with lower rates of interest and long period times till maturity. So you could actually just change away and have bonds being a floating rate, and the bond pays whatever the going rate of interest was. That could actually make that particular form of volatility less dangerous. But I think there's a good argument for building a central bank digital currency to enable that to be what we use for transactions, and then to drastically reduce the size of the financial sector. Here I'm going to become my favorite capitalist, Karl Marx. And Marx, writing in the 1880s, I think, had a wonderful line saying, "Talk about centralization. The big banks and the money lenders that surround them periodically give this bunch of parasites the capacity to take over the production system, and this gang knows nothing about it and should have nothing to do with it." Now, because we don't have that critical wisdom of banking that Marx had and that Schumpeter had and Fisher and a whole range of non-orthodox thinkers, we've allowed banks to do what they bloody well like to do, as if they're masters of the universe. They're not. As Marx called them, I love this term, they're the roving cavaliers of credit. You make sure your cavaliers can't stay out too late at night and can't screw too many of the noblemen's women. That's what you need to do. And we've let them go, rampant behavior. And that's what's given us a massively financialized system. We'd be far better off with a far smaller financial system.
Well, this is somewhat new information to me, which is interesting, the idea that, I've heard of CBDCs before, but that you might think that that's a reasonable sort of solution here, or possible one. Is it that radical, really? I mean, basically, we just haven't had the technology to be able to reasonably do it before now. So we've always had commercial banks as a necessary evil, I would have thought, if that's a okay way to sum it up. So if just flesh out that world that you have CBDCs in the background, and that actually sounds like the formalization of what you were talking about before, where you do split the payments and the loan facilities into something. So let's flesh that out and look at what that alternative system would look like in total.
Yeah, well, you couldn't do it before the days of electronic banking, because you had to have physical retail bank branches for people to go and apply for loans and get cash out and take their passbooks in and all that physical stuff. Which I'm old enough to remember that period, and my father was a significant bank manager at the time, so I was just aware of the infrastructure. It was enormous to maintain the payment system. Now that you've got electronic banking, and you're seeing this yourself. In my local bank branch, I went to open an account here in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago. I got there, the branch had been shut down. It was a 2-kilometre walk to the nearest bank branch, and I'm in the heart of Amsterdam, absolutely the heart of the place. So for me, I had to walk 2 kilometres outside the city to go to a bank branch. So what's now happening, because of electronic banking, the banks are reducing their physical infrastructure, reducing their costs that way. But what it means is we don't need them anymore. You could do the same thing with with an electronic banking system. Do it on our phones. We could all have accounts at the central bank, and that would actually make a lot of the monetary management that governments do with fiscal policy much more straightforward, because you'd go straight from central bank. The treasury money would be paid directly from the treasury's account of the central bank to individual recipients in their payment system, in the central bank system, and then the private banks would exist only for the things where you really do want private money creation. And this is where I have my issues with Richard Werner. Okay, but I think Richard Werner's got a good handle on this in terms of what you need for successful investment banking, and that is you've got to have people on the ground in different parts of a country who get to know the local entrepreneurs, know who's likely to be a good credit risk, who's going to have good ideas, and that gives you a creative link where you want to rely upon financiers trying to make a profit to making choices and being more creative than you might get out of a bureaucratic system trying to create the money the same way.
And it may solve some of the problems there, as highlighted by sociopaths need to be regulated, about Peter Thiel maybe having much more of an influence on, say, a run on a bank than any individual should. But that sort of problem does disappear with a central bank running all of our payment systems.
Yeah, there ain't no run you can do. You can't do a run on the central bank. Good luck.
Exactly. Good luck. It probably does it introduce any other problems? Let's play devil's advocate. Is it because there'll be people probably listening to this and going like, oh no, central banks, like I don't know who's out there wanting to defend commercial banks. Do you know what I mean? But still, there'll be people wanting to shoot holes in it. What are some of the arguments against it if we steel man the whole argument with finding out what's wrong with it?
I think there's, now that we've got electronic money as broadly existing as we have, then there's not an argument against central banks being the payment system. The problem has always been central banks being the distribution system, deciding who gets money, and that is where I mean I'm as much a critic of bureaucrats as the next libertarian, even though I'm not a libertarian. So there are some areas where I don't want bureaucrats involved. I got that at university. When I started at university, the bureaucrats were the secretaries who organised everything for us and took workload away. When I leave 40 years later, the bureaucrats are telling us what to do, and they have no damn idea of how academics work. So I've got a very negative attitude towards bureaucracy in that sense, and that for reason I would like to see the creation of money being something which is though they're not not so much the creation necessarily, but the distribution of money created for entrepreneurs being something which is decided by financiers who are themselves operating as entrepreneurs. So that's a reason to say that the central bank shouldn't have the entire responsibility. But one other thing we can do as well, in the modern age, which we couldn't do again 20 years ago, is with the growth of crowdfunding. It's possible to get the wisdom of crowds to decide who gets money. So what banks are doing, and like I'll talk about one of my favorite examples. An old friend of mine was a mining engineer who became a advisor to one of the Australian banks on which mining projects to invest in. He knew mining bloody well, and therefore when he'd go out and check a mine, he'd be able to say this mine's going to succeed, this one will fail, and with that wisdom he had, he can make sensible decisions. These days, you got a whole bunch of people who just are all involved in lending for housing, and if there's a house on a block of land, they'll lend to it. That is just pathetic. But what you want is the individuals to be skilled and knowing if they don't get it right, they lose money. That is more of a motivation to choose wisely. So I would sort of mainly, I'm actually more and more biased in favor of a payment system run by central banks. And then a much smaller financial system operating effectively as venture capitalists for corporations to get them both, in some cases, working capital, but also fundamentally money for new ideas. And that's coming back to the best idea that came out of Schumpeter. Schumpeter described banks as being the source of funds for entrepreneurs. And his definition of an entrepreneur was somebody with a good idea, but no money. So in that case, the entrepreneurs enable technological change to take place, but they need finance to do it. And that should be the role of the banking system. Now, if Schumpeter pretended it is the way they function, Schumpeter's student Minsky pointed out, they cause bubbles. And that's the danger. We need to put them back in the box they belong in, where they're providing finance for innovative ideas. And that these days, given the technology we have, is an argument for the central banks having the payment system and the private banks being a small venture capitalist wing to enable entrepreneurs to be able to turn good ideas into new products.
Now, there have been some comments earlier about LVT, and we can solve it with all this and that. We have done a deep dive on monetary policy separately. If you're interested, go back an episode. So it's just for those that are listening. But would changing that system somehow resolve some of the big private debt problems? You've talked about a debt jubilee, of course, Steve. Do you think? Yeah. Do you think even if you change that system, there's other things that we need to do to sort out? I mean, you wouldn't change that system overnight tomorrow. It still wouldn't solve massive private debt problems. So you'd still have to deal with that, wouldn't you? Or would it untangle over time somehow?
There's an argument in favor of the private debt. This is one thing which came out of my modeling of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, and it's what's called an emergent property of a complex system. I simply made a model where I had the three variables were the debt ratio, private debt to GDP, the employment ratio, those were the job divided by population, and the wages share of GDP, wages divided by GDP. Put it into a simple dynamic model, and I got the bizarre outcome that even though I had in the model that the capitalists were the ones borrowing the money, and the capitalists were therefore the ones creating debt, the people who suffered from the high level of debt were workers. The workers' share of income declined. It ended up being an emergent property of the dynamics of the system that there's three social classes in the system: capitalists, workers, and bankers. Capitalists would start to reinvest at a target share of rate of profit, like say 7% average rate of profit. That would then be the point at which capitalists would borrow more money than they earned. If they were earning 8 and 9%, they'd borrow more than they'd spend more than their investments on. More than their profits on investments, so they need to borrow the difference. That would have been rising level of debt, and then below that rate they'd pay it off. Now it didn't matter with three social classes. It didn't matter to capitalists who got the money on the other side, the workers or the bankers. So as the level of debt went up, the proportion available to workers went down. We've actually seen that in the data. There's been a dramatic drop in workers' share of income, and it does correlate with the rise in the level of private debt. So if we can drop the level of private debt radically, and it should be, I think, about 1/3 what it is now, rather than 170% up, it should be about 50 or 60% of GDP. If we do that, we'll actually change the emergent dynamics back in favor of workers and have more basic consumption coming out of the system. So there's lots of reasons to reduce the level of private debt, and to make a smaller financial system would be a much better one than we've got right now.
Yeah, I think it's hard for people to imagine. There was a time when we didn't have a financialization of our economy, and probably for those that are younger, it's always been that way. So it just does seem strange. But the 50s and 60s, and perhaps basically up until the 80s, there was no, you didn't expect to go into banking to make a lot of money. At least, certainly not the kind of crazy money that's made today. Maybe, is it? Can you maybe flesh out just for anybody that isn't from that era, didn't grow up in it,
Yeah.
what finance was actually like culturally back then, and why it's totally different to now.
I think that what I'd recommend is watch a few old movies. Watch actually Back to the Future. It's not a bad example, because in the 50s and 60s, a single income working class person could support a family. That was the period that was called the Golden Age of Capitalism. I think Simon Margan came up with that term, because you had high levels of economic growth, high levels of technological development, and people, a family with a single income earner, normally the male, obviously, in those days, could provide enough income for the whole family to be able to survive, and be comfortable. And at that stage, back in America, the level of private debt as a percentage of GDP was about 50%. Now, from that point on, it rose from 50% to 170% of GDP. And that period of transition from low levels of private debt to high is what's given us financialized economy. And now you have engineers who back in the 50s and 60s would work for General Electric, or maybe even this speculative company called Boeing, working for them. Instead, they go and work for, they push spreadsheets rather than slide rules, and they end up doing financial speculation and financial engineering. And like financial engineering is to real engineering, is blowing up a bridge as to building one.
I didn't know that Back to the Future would be in today's session. I'm really impressed you got that in there. Now, a comment there from Marai. I just don't know why it can't be both public and private commercial banks. Is there a response you've got to that, Steve?
Yeah, I think there's a role for a publicly owned bank, even if you still stick with the current system where the payment system is private. There's a role for a public bank which operates on different principles to the private banks. The trouble is, and I've seen this in Australia with what's called the State Bank of Victoria, you can have a state-owned bank being taken over by somebody who's exactly the same, cut from the same cloth as the private financial bubble speculators, and the State Bank of Victoria was one of the first ones to go bankrupt, and that bankruptcy then led to the state government, which of course can't create money, making all sorts of pledges to increase its revenue and reduce its spending. And so the crash of a public bank actually caused the collapse of the transportation system of that city. So it's but our credit unions are very sensible. We've managed to almost eliminate them. But you look back at the British system used to only allow credit unions to lend for housing. Now, when that happened, at that period, it's up to 1982, the level of private debt in the UK never exceeded 70% of GDP. Maggie Thatcher deregulated that, let banks lend. Instead, you got this huge housing bubble, and debt went from 70% of GDP to 210%. So credit union-based systems, a publicly owned bank, perhaps a central bank handling the transaction system, and much smaller private financial system. That's I think a preferred way to go. Whether we'll get there, pigs might fly.
I'm thinking we need a slogan for this movement. Let's make banking boring again. Maybe
Absolutely.
that'll work. Who knows? Maybe, I don't know the acronym.
I'm too old for this this program these days. But the banking used to be described as a 3-6-3 business. Charge at 3, borrow at 3, lend at 6, and be on the golf course by 3 p.m. And that'd be a much healthier form of banker than the ones we have now.
And I wonder if culturally one of the attractions to the story of Bitcoin, because I don't believe I'm sure you don't. I know you don't, Steve. Think it's a relevant or viable alternative, but the story of Bitcoin is one in which part of it is that your money's safe. Of course, it's a Ponzi scheme as well now. That's something new. But originally, it was after the 2008 crash, and it was like, well, your money should be safe, and that sort of thing. And I wondered if the central bank as your payment system, and it's 100% guaranteed, because how can it not be guaranteed? It's where the money is made. There's no intermediary. It might actually turn some people back to that. And what would you say to that? Do you think that's psychologically a part of the attraction of, well, if not all crypto, then certainly Bitcoin?
Crypto is a large part of the attraction of crypto was both this hard money and safe money. Okay, and they thought it was safer. I mean, maybe it is. Tulips were once as well, but but certainly what Bitcoin is a non-financial asset. Bitcoin is an asset to you and a liability to no one, and that's often been a temptation for hard money people to believe money should be a commodity or a proto-commodity, and that's what Bitcoin does. But I think there's a lot of sociopaths there saying money's safe with Bernie Madoff. I think your money's safe with Bitcoin as well. As soon as the energy system collapses, so does Bitcoin.
Yeah, and as Ty's pointed out, at least so far, it appears that Bitcoin rises and falls with the size of the deficit from year to year.
Absolutely, it's driven by the monetary, driven by fiscal, by fiat money creation. Yeah, nice one.
And so it doesn't, but that's not a story that's big enough, and we should make that as big as we can. That particular story. I think Ty's got a great insight there, along with Douglas. So we are at the top of the hour, and I think we haven't got a slogan yet, but let's make banking boring again, which is a terrible acronym. It's hardly MAGA. Is at least a start. I think that's something we can work on. So I hope everyone tuning in has got something new out of that. At least crunching all of the stuff we've talked about at length before about banking generally, just into one tight place. And so we're gonna head off. I hope you'll tune in with us again next week. And for now, it's goodbye from Steve Keen and friends.